Welcome to Psych Saturdays, where we go over psychiatric disorders. Today we're going over ADHD and which parts of the brain cause certain symptoms. I'm also going to give you super easy and fun mnemonics to remember which brain part causes which ADHD symptom. Here are the 4 brain areas in ADHD we're going to go over. You can pause here if you'd like. Here's a quick picture view of all the different brain areas: the motor cortex, the dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex in yellow, and the orbital frontal cortex in purple. And then number 4, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. Let's start with number 1, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. This one is responsible for selective attention. But what is selective attention? It allows us to block out external noises and external distractions. Like if you're sitting in your classroom at school and your friend is making noises or playing around, you'd be able to block that out if you don't have ADHD or if you're properly treated for ADHD. Here are some examples of selective attention problems in children with ADHD that aren't treated. They seem like they're not listening. They get distracted really easily. They forget things all the time, and they're careless on tests. How do you test for selective attention though? Well, you use something called the Stroop task. And that's where you have to pay attention to the colors and not the words. And this is pretty difficult. So in this example, you see all these words. Remember, pay attention to the colors. So the first one's red, second one's green, third one is orange, fourth one is pink, and fifth one is blue. Okay, got it. I know what it does, but how do I remember it? Well, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex is also known as DACC or DAC. So how we're going to remember it is we're going to imagine a duck. DAC, duck. How can we remember selective attention? Well, imagine a sieve of alarm bells. A sieve for selective, alarm bells for attention. Now, how can we tie these two together so you remember both of them? That one goes with the other. Well, imagine thousands of ducks flying through the air, but oh no, they get sucked through the sieve made of alarm bells. Kind of like what would happen if the ducks got sucked through an airplane engine. So that's a very vivid image you can imagine, and it'll help you remember it. Now, what is sustained attention? And here, we're talking about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, there in yellow. And that is associated with sustained attention. What is sustained attention? Well, it's about keeping your attention or keeping your focus on something, even if the circumstances are perfect, aka no one's distracting you. The examples of this in ADHD would look like the child doesn't finish things, the child is disorganized, or they can't stay focused for long. But how do you test sustained attention? You use something called the N-back test. N basically stands for a number. And in this test, you would have to remember what the number was and how many N backs it was ago. So if it's a 1 back test, that means you would be shown one number and then you'd be shown a different number. And when you're shown that different number, you'd be asked, what was the number just back then? If it's a 2 N back test, you'd be shown 2 different numbers, and then you'd be asked what the number was 2 numbers ago. If it's a 3 N back test, you'd be shown 3 numbers, and then you'd be asked what the number was 3 numbers ago, and so on. As you can imagine, it's a little easier when you're just in the 1, the 2, the 3 back, but once you get up to higher N back numbers, it can get pretty tough. Now, how do we remember sustained attention and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? Well, for dorsolateral, we're going to imagine a door lock. For prefrontal cortex, we're going to imagine a puzzle made of corks. So the whole thing together, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is a door lock puzzle corks. Door lock puzzle made of corks. And you can see that in the picture there. How can we remember sustained attention? Imagine a steam train for sustained, and it's riddled with alarm bells. There's just alarm bells all over it, which stands for attention for us. So it's a steam train with alarm bells. Steam train, sustained, alarm bells, attention. Now, how can we link those two together? Well, imagine the steam train riddled with alarm bells is bursting through the door lock puzzle made of corks' front gate. It's bursting through that door. You can imagine that really vividly. Now, what is hyperactivity? Well, first of all, that happens in the prefrontal motor cortex. As we can see here, the prefrontal motor cortex is the one in green. Now, what does this look like? Well, it looks like energy is just overflowing, way too much energy. And some examples of hyperactivity in ADHD include fidgeting, standing up from your seat, running and climbing, always being on the go, and not doing activities quietly. How do you test for hyperactivity? Well, you observe the child, you watch the child. This is done in school, at home, and when the child is being evaluated. So how can we remember hyperactivity and the prefrontal motor cortex? Well, for hyperactivity, we can imagine an engine vrooming. And you see in the picture there, there's steam coming out of the engine. The motor part of the prefrontal cortex is the engine, and the hyperactivity part is the vrooming of the engine, the steam coming out of it. This one is an easier one, so we don't need a story. Now, what are impulsive symptoms? What's impulsivity? Well, first of all, impulsivity in ADHD comes from the orbital frontal cortex, which is the one in purple right there in the brain. And what does impulsivity look like in ADHD? Well, it looks like not being able to control urges. And examples of this in ADHD would look like the child is talking too much, talks over others, has little patience and doesn't want to wait his turn, and is intrusive on others' activities. How do you test for impulsivity? This is the same as hyperactivity. It's going to be observation, watching at school, at home, and in the office during the evaluation. Now, how can you remember the orbital frontal cortex and impulsivity? Well, let's get two pictures here. The orbital frontal cortex, we're going to turn that into eye fountain cork. It's an eye fountain made of corks. And for impulsive, we're going to imagine Conor McGregor, an MMA fighter. Fighters are usually very impulsive. And the story we're going to remember to link these two is imagine an impulsive Conor McGregor running in the water and punching the eye fountain cork right in the eye. Now let's go over all the ones we just went over to really solidify it. So for the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DAC, we're going to imagine a duck, okay? DAC, we need to link that with selective attention. So the duck, we're going to imagine ducks flying through the sieve. Selective attention is the sieve made of alarm bells. We're going to imagine the ducks flying through that, getting obliterated. Number two, for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, that one has to do with sustained attention. So sustained attention, the steam train riddled with alarm bells, imagine that bursting through the door lock puzzle corks's front door, the front gate. Imagine it just bursting through that. Now, number three, how can we remember prefrontal motor cortex, also known as just motor cortex? And how can we link that with hyperactivity? Well, the prefrontal motor cortex, we're going to imagine an engine. And for hyperactivity, we're going to imagine the engine going so hard that now it's steaming. So a vrooming engine. Number four, the orbital frontal cortex, the OFC. How can we link that with impulsive symptoms? Impulsivity, same thing. Well, for impulsivity, we're going to imagine Conor McGregor. So we're imagining an impulsive Conor McGregor running in the water and punching the eye fountain cork right in the eye. Remember, orbital frontal cortex is eye fountain cork. And this is the story we're going to tell ourselves to remember it. Here's the sources we used today. Let me know in the comments what you'd like me to cover next.